As we approach the conclusion of the 6th millennium and the introduction of the 7th millennium, it is most important for Christians to understand the last book of the Bible, the book of the Revelation. Gary Stearman is here to discuss with me this fascinating book.
And thousands of people, millions over the ages, have found it fascinating. There are literally hundreds of books expounding Revelation. And of course, Revelation is the summation, really, of the Bible. It summarizes the church age in chapters 1 through 3. Beginning with chapter 4, it moves before the throne of God. We have a picture of the Lamb of God opening the 7 seals. The earth is judged. Eventually, all the world systems are judged. And the Lord Jesus Christ returns with the armies of heaven to set up the kingdom. Very well-known Bible themes. And we're very familiar with those themes. However, there may be, and we believe there is, a much deeper way of looking at Revelation.
Now, the scriptures tell us here that John is on the island of Patmos having a vision on the Lord's day. That statement alone, to me, takes us into the future, Gary, to the 7th millennium. That is the day of the Lord, the 7th millennium. And when he says, for example, in verse 1, the revelation of Jesus Christ which God gave to him to show unto his servants things which must shortly come to pass. He was not talking to first century Christianity. He was talking to the 7th millennium Christianity. In other words, to those of us who are approaching the dawning of the 7th millennium, he has a message for us. And from this viewpoint, it must shortly come to pass. He said in verse 3, blessed is he that readeth, and they that hear the words of this prophecy, and keep those things which are written therein, for the time is at hand. My friend, the time was not at hand at the end of the 1st century. When John wrote from the Isle of Patmos around AD 96, and he wrote and sent this letter out to the 7 churches, the entire book of the Revelation was not primarily to them. Metaphorically speaking, they were being used as God's way of showing the Lord's day, the 7th millennium. But to those who live at the introduction of the 7th millennium, the time is at hand. And there's a blessing in store for those of us in this day who read it and keep it and hear the words of this prophecy. Gary, down through the past 2 millennia, people have floundered in this book. They have not understood it.
And as a matter of fact, Augustine, writing way back in the early 5th century, believed that the book of Revelation had already been completely fulfilled in the 1st century at the destruction of the temple in AD 70. And beginning with Augustine and other expositors, there arose a confusion about how to place this thing in time and space. And to some extent, that confusion still reigns.
Which means that the book of Revelation was not really written for those in previous centuries. They didn't understand it. It was written for the future generation, for that generation which is to come, for the last generation, as we see in the Acharon of the Hebrew in the Psalms.
Yes.
And in order to understand the book of Revelation, we must understand the Hebrew alphabet, the Hebrew language, and the nature of John's writing this book. And Gary, to me, the book was originally written in Hebrew. It had to be. There are 22 chapters corresponding to the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet.
As a matter of fact, that's true, and we've chronicled that in our book, The Mystery of the Menorah and the Hebrew Alphabet. And to clearly explain where we're going to go with this, we need to review a little bit about the temple menorah. Its structure, it had 7 lamps, and those 7 lamps had a structure, 3 on each side, 1 in the middle, the servant lamp. Really were a picture of Jesus Christ. He's revealed that way here in the 1st chapter of Revelation. not only are they a picture of Christ, but they show us how any grouping of 7 should be considered. We, Gentiles, number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, but in the Hebrew way of looking at things, the number 4, that is that center lamp position called the servant lamp, representing Christ, is the important position, and it depicts the redemptive struggle of man with the aid of the God of grace. And we've chronicled this, of course, in several articles. Now, lest you think this is going to turn into a boring exposition about numbers and letters of the Hebrew alphabet, no, we've got some really exciting things to share with you.
You know, before you can fully understand where we're coming from and why we believe the book of the Revelation the way we do, you need to understand what we've written in this book, the mystery of the menorah and the Hebrew alphabet. We see the menorah in chapter 1, Jesus standing in the midst of the menorah, the 7 golden lampstand. And so in this book, we've given you the history of the lampstand, and then the last half of the book deals with the letters of the Hebrew alphabet, and in particular, the book of Revelation. When Jesus says in Revelation chapter 1, I am Alpha and Omega, and he repeats that in the 22nd chapter, I am Alpha and Omega, what he is saying is, I am the first and the last letters of the alphabet. But the Alpha and Omega are Greek equivalents of the Hebrew letters. Jesus is really the Aleph and the Tav, because the meaning of Aleph can be seen in chapter 1, and the meaning of Tav can be seen in chapter 22. And we explain all of this in this book. And then, you know, Gary, we did a study on the Hebrew alphabet. We have 28 studies here. You see these videotapes? There are 28 studies called the Mysteries of the Hebrew Alphabet, in which we go through every anomaly, shall we say, in the Bible and show you the meanings of those letters and how they relate to the various parts of the Bible. You need that before you can really understand the book of the Revelation. Now, Revelation says the revelation of Jesus Christ. Well, if you really want it revealed to you, you've got to start out with the language it was written in. Now, we don't have a copy of Revelation in Hebrew. All we have is the Greek, but it is obvious that before the Greek it had to be in Hebrew.
Now we need to point out that that Moses was given instructions on how to build that 7-branched lampstand called the menorah, and then later on, in the days of the rebuilding of the second temple, in the days of the prophet Zechariah, Zechariah had a vision which he saw this golden lampstand, but it had an additional 2 members, one on the right, one on the left, bringing the total number of lamps to 9. The same structure, except now you've got 9 lamps, 4 on each side. 1 in the middle is still the servant lamp. And the 2 extra lamps that are added on each side are called the 2 witnesses. J.R., this is prophetic to the hilt. Yes. And here is the way it ties into what we're going to be studying. The New Testament is 27 books in length. That divides 3 ways into 3 nines. And those 9s correspond to that ancient structure of the 9-branch lampstand as given to Zechariah. Now, the first 9 run Matthew through Galatians, and they talk about the coming of the King, his crucifixion, his resurrection, the establishment of the church. The second 9 deal with the practical matters of the church. They are Ephesians through Philemon, and they are Paul's epistles, letters to the church. The final 9 run Hebrews through Revelation. And these 9 books are directed to the Jews. They are prophetic in scope. There are 9 books. The 9 concluding books of the New Testament are prophecy, prophecy, prophecy. And once we discover the key, based upon the alphabet, based upon structure, about how to look at the book of Revelation, you are going to be thrilled.
Yeah. Upon the structure of the menorah and the Hebrew alphabet, you'll be able to see how the book of the Revelation just is more glorious than you could have ever imagined before. And Gary, in particular, Hebrews through Revelation, this final 9, you said is all prophecy.
Yes, it is.
And it is all futurist. And it's interesting that the book of Hebrews, being the 19th book, is actually the Koph book, that is the Hebrew letter Koph, 19th letter, which refers to cycles of growth and points to the second coming of Jesus Christ. And it's interesting that it's the 19th because we just are concluding the 1900s. And so this takes us right to that date. There's more. We'll be back in just a moment. Don't go away. Up until about 100 years ago, most theologians knew Hebrew. They studied Hebrew. Hebrew, in fact, was needed in the colleges and universities and seminaries of early America. But no longer are men required to study Hebrew. That's a shame. In order to understand the book of the Revelation, in order to understand the Bible, you need to understand the original language. And if you're interested in studying Hebrew, after you study or look at the 28 studies we have on the mysteries of the Hebrew alphabet, you may want to enjoy studying Hebrew at your own leisure. This is the Hebrew Tutor. It is a CD-ROM for your computer. And it says here, move at your own pace through this engaging interactive sight and sound tutorial, grammar lessons, and proven studies build naturally on your skills, taking you through an entire first-year college-level course in biblical Hebrew. And it says you'll be able to read the book of Ruth in its own language when you get through with this.
JR, you know what I like about this Hebrew Tutor, having looked at it myself, you can start at the lowest, easiest, conceivable level, so amazingly simply that there's no possible room for error. Very easy, and then you can progress at your own speed. That's what I like about it, and having known some Hebrew myself, I looked at the intermediate and concluding levels of it, and I've actually learned quite a bit myself.
So, as we look at the book of Revelation, let us keep the Hebrew letters in mind. Let's take Aleph, for example, for that is the letter of chapter 1. The Aleph stands for the Creator and the King. Gary, we see Jesus Christ here as the King, as Creator. He says, for example, I am Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the ending, saith the Lord, which is, and which was, and which is to come, the Almighty. He is God the Creator. He is the King of the universe. And we can see this in the Hebrew flavoring of the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet.
Absolutely, and he is standing in the midst, verse 13 of chapter 1 says he's standing in the midst of 7 candlesticks. Now, better we should say he's standing in the midst of 7 lampstands, which makes him the servant lamp of the menorah, the 7-branched menorah, and he is assuming the position that he held in the ancient tabernacle back in the days of the Exodus and the wilderness journeys. There was always that burning lampstand just inside the curtain of the holy place. And you know, JR, Jesus was there, and here he is again in the candelabra, the menorah, the 7-branched lampstand.
Now, as we look at chapter 1 and the whole 22 chapters of the book of Revelation, we want you to see Jesus Christ in all of his majesty and glory. We feel that this is the time in history for God's people to really get an in-depth study of the book of Revelation. So this is not going to be a surface rendering. Gary, we'll probably be on this all summer long.
Indeed, and again, we have so much to share with you that is non-technical. Don't worry about getting lost in a forest of numbers and letters. We have some very straightforward teaching right out of the verses of Revelation. Actually, we're going to look at the final 9 books, Hebrews through Revelation, to show you how John really wrote a latter day or last days view of things.
Now, the menorah, since Jesus here is standing in the midst of the menorah, this is the revealing of Jesus Christ in all of his Shekinah, the Shekinah glory. We see him as John turns to hear the one talking with him, and being turned, he sees in the midst of 7 candlesticks, one likened to the Son of Man, clothed with a garment down to the foot, and girt about the paps with a golden girdle. His head and his hairs were white like wool, as white as snow, and his eyes were as a flame of fire. And this is a marvelous description of Christ, unlike anything ever seen about him before. This is the glorified Christ. This is the Christ who is coming back in Revelation chapter 19. And he is seen here in chapter 1 because this is the book of the Revelation.
That's right. And Aleph, represented by chapter 1, is called the book of creation and the king. We see Jesus here in the form of the Creator and the King.
So let's look briefly at the 7 lamps of the menorah. We have the center lamp that stands above. We have 3 on either side turned facing the center lamp. So the center lamp is called the servant lamp, the shamish. And Gary, our sun is also called by the same root Hebrew word, the shamish, because it is that flame of fire up there.
That's right.
That stands as the center of the universe, and revolving around it are the lamps called the planets. And Flavius Josephus, Jewish historian of the 1st century, in giving the description of the menorah from the book of Exodus, and from the law of Moses, he says that these 7 lamps represent the 7 wanderers through the heaven, the sun, the moon, and the planets. And so we can see this heavenly design. It's kind of interesting to me, Gary, that the ayin, which stands for the eye, is also pictured as the sun, a flame of fire. And here we have that same reference to it when it says his eyes are as a flame of fire.
Yeah, and J.R., he is, as the sun, verse 16, shineth in his strength. So here he is actually compared with the sun. I remember now the servant lamp called shamish. The sun in Hebrew is called shemesh, which is cognate. Just change a couple of vowels, and you have a slightly different
vowel
word.
Points.
Vowel points. And,
which really didn't even exist in the 1st century as far as we know. Now, the interesting thing about this, Gary, is that Jesus is standing in the middle. That's on the servant lamp. He is the servant lamp. And he is the light of the world as the servant lamp. But it's kind of interesting that in these 7 lamps, we don't have a 1 through 7 exactly. We have a 1, a 4, and a 7. And the 7 is a 1, and the 1 is a 7, or whichever way you look at it. And they both relate to number 4. So we have the numbers 1, 4, and 7 all relate to the same subject. It's kind of interesting that the first lamp always refers to the same subject as the 7th lamp. The second lamp always refers to the same subject as the 6th lamp. The third lamp always refers to the same subject as the 5th lamp. So in this menorah design, in all the 7s of the Bible, every 7 found in this book right here has a menorah design. And the 4th of any 7 in the Bible is the one that gives the light, provides the light to understand there are others.
Now, I should quickly point out that when you divide the New Testament into 3 parts, as we did, the first 9 books are Jewish in nature. The king comes to his people.
Yes.
Matthew through Galatians. Galatians is a refutation of the law. The second 9 books, which are Ephesians through Philemon, strictly written to the church, or shall we say to Gentile Christians. The third 9 books are addressed once again to the Jews. So the first 9 to the Jews, the middle 9 to the Gentiles, the third 9 to the Jews, including Revelation. Revelation is a Jewish book, and we have to look at it that way.
And that's why we need to understand the letters of the Hebrew alphabet. You don't have to become a PhD in Hebrew to understand the meanings of these letters. And as you go through these 28 studies, for example, that we have provided in these videotapes, these 7 videotapes, 28 studies on the mysteries of the Hebrew alphabet, we will show you how to understand every letter and how it relates to every section of scriptures throughout the Bible. It's important to understand the Jewish nature and the Jewish flavor of this book. Gary, I'm convinced Hebrew was the language of heaven and the language of Adam and the language of the human race until the Tower of Babel.
Absolutely, and it's a unique language because it is structured according to the redemptive plan of God. That is, the 22 letters represent 22 aspects of God's redemption, and it's as clear can be. We're not talking about anything mystical here at all. This teaching goes back to the days of King David. King David wrote a psalm, an alphabetic psalm, 145, which clearly demonstrates that he knew exactly how the alphabet worked.
You know how popular the Bible codes have been the last few years?
Oh, yeah.
Equidistant letter sequences, well, that's of Hebrew letters. And if you know, there are a lot of folks who get excited about the possibility of finding secret messages encoded in the original language of the Bible. Well, don't you think you need to understand what those Hebrew letters are all about before you get to first base with this? Now, if the first 9 books of the New Testament are Jewish, then you need to understand Hebrew. And if the last 9 books of the New Testament are Jewish in nature, you need to understand the Hebrew language. And even if you don't become a PhD in Hebrew and never are able to speak Hebrew fluently, you still need to know the design of the letters. And there's more, much more. We'll be back in just a moment.